Hi everyone, my name is Susanna Macbeth and I'm with South Coast Natural Resource Management based in Albany on WA's South Coast. Welcome to the webinar today. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the Menang Noongar traditional owners of the country on which I live and work. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. We do have people joining us from all around Australia today, so I would also like to acknowledge traditional custodians throughout Australia. In recent years, most farmers I've spoken to in various capacities have mentioned soil carbon. It's been a hot topic as land managers and policymakers grapple with the question of whether increasing soil carbon sequestration is one of the answers to tackling climate change. So the big question for today is, can grazing management increase soil carbon? Our three speakers are here to try and provide some answers to this question, thanks to the review they undertook to find out what the published peer-reviewed literature says on this topic. This work was recently published in the Journal of Environmental Management. The research and today's webinar is part of the Carbon Storage Partnership, a program funded by Meat and Livestock Australia, which seeks to explore and develop pathways to carbon neutral red meat production by 2030. So just a bit of housekeeping before I introduce our speakers. The webinar is being recorded and will be distributed online afterwards. Please make sure your microphone is turned off. Questions to speakers are encouraged. Please use the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And if the webinar is disconnected for any reason, as can sometimes happen, please rejoin via the original link. My colleague Kylie Fletcher is behind the scenes to answer any technical questions that you might have. Just pop those in chat if you have any concerns. So, of course, in webinars, there's no chance to catch up over a cup of tea before the main event begins. So instead, I'm just going to put up a few questions on screen for you to answer, both so that the speakers can get a sense of who they're talking to, but also so that you can all get an idea of who else might be in the room, so to speak. So you should have the poll up on your screen there. If you just click on that, there's 4 multiple choice questions there. So if you just click on that, it's great to get an idea of why people have joined us today and also where you're joining from. So you'll see in question 2 there, got the various regions around Australia. There are 4 questions, so I can see a couple of answers coming in there. That's great. We're also really curious to know, I guess, why people are joining in terms of the capacity in which you're joining today. Are you a farmer? Are you a researcher? Are you perhaps an advisor? It's really useful for us to understand who might be in the audience today in terms of who's interested in the information. All right, I'll just give that a couple more minutes. I see we've got 64 people in the room, so that's fantastic. Give that a couple more minutes. All right, thanks to everyone who's answering those questions. Now, just give that another minute. All right, thank you. Now, you should now be able to see the results of that on your screen there. So, yeah, no surprises, I suppose, that most people are interested in understanding whether soil carbon can be improved. So around Australia, bit of a mix there. That's good to see. A couple of people from overseas. And in terms of, 11 researchers and some farmers on the line, that's great to see. All right. Thank you very much for sharing that there. All right. So I might just get the speakers to turn on their videos now, and I'll introduce the speakers that are going to chat to you today. All right, so we've got Dr. Sarah McDonald, who's Pastures Research Officer with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries. Sarah's the lead author of the research review that we're going to be talking about today. Dr. Warwick Badgery is also with New South Wales DPI as their research leader on rangelands and tropical pastures. And Associate Professor Mackie Harrison, who's from the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture at the University of Tasmania, Matt leads the Carbon Storage Partnership project, and we'll hand over to him first to explain the background for this work.
Thank you very much, Kylie. I'll see if I can share my screen. Can you see that now, Susanna?
I can, yes.
Yep. So as Susanna mentioned, I lead the Carbon Storage Partnership, and Sustainable Pathways to CN30 is one project that sits under the Carbon Storage Partnership. As Susanna mentioned, it's co-funded by Meat and Livestock Australia, AWI, and a lot of other organisations. We're really looking at what farming systems interventions work best where. So it's a very multidisciplinary project. So we're looking at things like profit, sustainability, prosperity, environmental stewardship, and of course food security through animal production. So we're co-developing demand-driven interventions. So that's a bit of a mouthful, but really what I mean by that is going out to farmers across Australia, and we have a number of case study farms, and asking them what they would prospectively implement to improve carbon storage in soils or vegetation and or reduce or avoid greenhouse gas emissions. So they tell us what they're interested in, and then we go away and model it. And so they learn from us about the technical side of things and what we can prospectively model in terms of economics and soil carbon and profitability. And we learn from them about practical barriers to implementation, about their farming system. So it's a very much an iterative thing. We have farms from the northwest of Tasmania, which is quite small and high rainfall, 200 hectares, 1.2 metres of rain a year, to very large farms, 500,000 hectares in the centre of Australia, which get quite low rainfall, so 150 millimetres per year. So you can imagine that the ability to sequester carbon and reduce emissions and implement interventions is very different across these farming systems. We've got a large focus on spatially explicit carbon, so carbon in vegetation, as well as the spatially explicit biodiversity on farm and how that might change over time. So things for biodiversity, we're looking at threatened species, habitat condition. There's a big social arm to the Carbon Storage Partnership, so we're looking at farmer perceptions of grazing management as well as farmer perceptions of CN30 per se. So that work is sort of coming to a close. In the early part of next year, well, in the first quarter of next year, we'll have carbon accounting workshops. They'll be free. They'll be with anyone who wants to attend. I think numbers will probably be capped, but that's really just to say what tools are available. And for a certain number of farmers, we'll do a carbon account. So what's the emissions and what's the carbon and what's the carbon balance? And so really to raise awareness of what we can do to quantify greenhouse gas emissions. So part of what we did at the start of the Carbon Storage Partnership, and Sarah will elaborate on this, was an extensive review, particularly focused on Australia, because there has been reviews of soil carbon internationally. So what grazing management practices are likely to impact on soil carbon? So that's published, that's online now, that's in the what's called the Journal of Environmental Management. The link is there. I won't talk anymore. I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Sarah McDonald at New South Wales DPI, and Sarah can give you the details. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Matt. I'll just share my screen.
We've got it.
Hopefully you can see that all right. Okay. So as Matt mentioned, I'll just be giving a very brief summary today of some of the key results and findings from this review. Our review focused on the key components and processes in grazing systems that grazing management can have a potential impact on. And so some of those are shown on this screen here. So that included above ground biomass production, plant growth and species composition, ground cover and dung and urine inputs, and some below ground factors including root production and soil nitrogen, soil structure, and the soil microbial community. So as Matt said, our review looked to determine the effects of grazing management on these different factors. And so by grazing management, we're referring to different grazing intensities or altering the frequency, the timing, or the duration of that grazing system. So for example, the use of cell grazing or rotational systems or seasonal grazing systems, incorporating periods of rest into that. The original intent of the review was to identify some regionally specific grazing strategies that can increase soil carbon sequestration in grazing and pasture systems that can contribute towards the red meat industry's goal of carbon neutrality by 2030. So to ensure we captured all the published research within Australia, we undertook a systematic literature search. And with the articles that were returned through this, so almost 8,000 articles, we reviewed them against some specific criteria for inclusion in our review. So that included that the research had to have been undertaken in Australia. It had to have examined the impact of grazing management using domesticated livestock. So for our review, we haven't considered removing the impacts of removing livestock grazing altogether from systems, or other strategies such as the planting of legumes or land use changes. And it had to have reported on the impacts on one of those variables listed on that previous slide. So in total, from our review, we found 30 studies that had been undertaken in Australia that have examined the impacts of grazing management on soil carbon. 13 of these looked at the impacts of grazing intensity and 19 the impacts of grazing strategy. And the location of these studies is just shown on that map there. So we can see a fairly obvious clustering around New South Wales, as well as to the north and east of Queensland there especially. So we used a meta-analysis to help us combine the results from these multiple studies and identify the trends and patterns in the findings. So essentially we compared the means of different grazing treatments to calculate an effect size, and that's what's shown on these next few slides. In terms of the results, overall, we didn't find a significant impact of grazing intensity on soil carbon. We can see in that graph at the bottom of this slide here, where that x-axis is representing the effect size, and that black dot representing the mean of those studies that examined this, with the horizontal bar extending either side of that, representing the 95% confidence interval. And we see that that's overlapping 0 there. In the figure on the right-hand side, we've broken down those grazing comparisons into some different categories. So in the blue at the top, we can see moderate versus a high stocking rate. In the green, we've got low versus moderate stocking rates. And in the red, low versus high stocking rates or high grazing intensity. Each of those circles on those graphs are representing a different effect size that was reported in the studies. And we can see that they're distributed fairly evenly either side of that 0 line, and again with that confidence interval overlapping 0 for each of those comparisons, indicating a non-significant effect there. And in this case, for that graph, the larger circles are indicating more numbers of sites that were included in that analysis. So they were given a greater weighting in our study. For both of those graphs, I should also just mention that the numbers to the right indicate the number of data points and the number of studies that were included in each of those analyses. When we dove a bit deeper into each of those studies, of the 13 studies that examined grazing intensity, the majority didn't actually report a difference as a result of grazing intensity and on carbon. But we did find 3 that reported a negative effect of increasing intensity on soil carbon, and those are shown on that slide. We had similar results in regards to grazing strategy. So of the 19 studies, again, the majority didn't report any significant difference in carbon between different strategies, so continuous and rotational systems, for example. We did find one study that actually reported an increase in carbon under rotational grazing. That was a paper by Lodge in 2003 based on some modelled data. And we did find 2 that reported a small decrease in carbon with rotational grazing management. So that being Allen in 2013 and a paper by Orgel in 2014. Although in that paper, that difference was only apparent at the 70 centimetre depth and not at the 30 centimetre depth. So both of those figures are just showing the results of that meta-analysis there and just highlighting that non-significant result again. The graph on the right is breaking down into those different grazing categories again. So in the blue, we've got continuous versus seasonal grazing systems. So not many studies actually examined that in Australia. In the green, we've got continuous versus low or moderate rotational grazing systems, which we define to be less than 10 paddocks. And in the red, continuous versus a higher intensity rotational grazing system. So more than 10 paddocks, indicating a shorter period of graze and a longer period of rest in that system. So again, for each of those, still non-significant results. So we also examined the impact of grazing intensity and strategy on plant growth rate, herbage mass, and ground cover through the meta-analysis. We found that herbage mass and ground cover were both significantly greater under lower intensity grazing systems and under grazing systems that incorporate periods of rest. There weren't many studies that have examined the effects on plant growth rate, but overall this wasn't significant through our meta-analysis. Only 3 studies that were returned through our literature search examined the effect of grazing management on below ground biomass or root allocation. But of these 3, 2 did show that there's a lower root mass associated with higher stocking rates in some circumstances. And we haven't found any evidence in Australia for an impact of grazing strategy on below ground biomass. So overall, the review has found a lack of consistent evidence in Australia supporting measurable links between grazing intensity or strategy on soil organic carbon, other than that increasing grazing intensity can have a negative impact on soil carbon in some circumstances. There's a number of possible explanations for these findings, and Warwick will touch on a few of those in the next presentation. But despite this limited evidence, we did find that it does affect some of those key drivers of carbon sequestration, including above and below ground biomass production, plant growth rate, ground cover, soil structure, and nitrogen. And just going back to our original slide around the processes by which carbon can be sequestered in grazing systems, the conditions in which the soil carbon sequestration can be enhanced can potentially be achieved through management that aims to increase the plant growth rate and biomass, change the species composition in favour of perennial species, seafloor grasses, diversity or nitrogen fixing legumes, management that aims to improve below ground biomass production, reduce soil erosion and therefore losses of carbon, and promote microbiology also have the potential to enhance soil carbon sequestration. Noting, however, that there are a number of research gaps in Australia in particular, especially around that pasture growth rate, below ground production and microbiology and its interaction with grazing management. And there weren't many studies included in our review that actually examined the effects of grazing management systems that have been designed specifically to sequester carbon. So that's all I've got today. Again, that's just the reference for that article if you'd like to have a look at that, and happy to answer any questions on that afterwards, but I'll hand over to Warwick.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, I'm just going to pick up from where Sarah left off and to talk about what these results really mean and what are the implications if you're considering going into a soil carbon project and you're looking at grazing management as being the main method for enhancing soil carbon, what that actually means for you, or you're just interested in whether you can store carbon under grazing management. I'm just going to try and address some of those questions. So the 3 questions is, can grazing management increase soil carbon, and why were there no changes detected with grazing? I mean, this is a really common perception that improving your grazing management can enhance soil carbon. So I'm just going to go into a bit of the reasons why. There were, on average, sort of no results detected here. And I'll just briefly touch on what we do find reliably increases carbon as well, just as a bit of a note to finish off on. The first thing I'll say is grazing management can increase carbon, and just because the majority of studies have not shown it doesn't mean that it doesn't occur. So we've been able to document some changes in soil carbon under grazing management in a long-term study that we've conducted at Orange, where we've looked at basically 11 grazing management treatments between 2012 and it's still running now. We've collected soil carbon data across that experiment basically every 3 years since the start of the trial. And really our aim is to start teasing apart the effects of grazing management and a lot of the effects that we were looking at in this review. So the key one of those being stocking rate, where we had a high and a low, and then a flexible stocking rate, which was very much matched to adjusting the grazing pressure to the available feed at the time. So it's one that had a lot of flexibility to adjust to seasonal deficits. We looked at the paddock number in the grazing system. So obviously there's one paddock that's a continuous grazing system that is grazed more or less consistently the whole time, except when we had to pull the animals off for management or there was absolutely no feed and they were being fully supplementary fed. And we also had 15 and 30 paddock systems and their rotations that moved around either 15 or 30 paddocks. And then we also looked at the rest length. So with one paddock, obviously there's no rest, but we also, with the 15 and 30 paddock, we had combinations of a shorter rest, which was on average 56 days. So that did vary throughout the year, being a bit quicker when the pasture was growing more quickly and slower during the non-growing season. And then we had a long rest period, which was out to 112 days. And the flexible generally got grazed mostly on the 56-day cycle or around that, but occasionally went out to longer rest length if it was very little growth over that period. The other key thing to note is we didn't implement these whole systems because it's just too big and too complex. So what we've done is, of the intensive rotations, we've implemented parts of the system so that we've got, we wouldn't have measured every paddock that's actually rotated around, but we've got, say, a section of those paddocks that we're actually monitoring over time. And then when they're not in that system, the animals go off and onto another part of our research farm. So with that, we all started with reasonably consistent levels of soil carbon back at the start of the experiment when we baselined before we started in 2012. So it was actually done in December 2011. And then we've had an increase in soil carbon. So I've just got the stocks change here in the top 10 centimetres, but the 0 to 30 centimetres looks very similar over that period of time. And so what we found was that generally most of the rotational grazing treatments went up over that period. The continuous grazing also went up over that period, but at a lower rate. And so the reason that everything went up was basically there was a new pasture sown on this site about 18 months before the trial began. And so we had this underlying pasture establishment increase in soil carbon, and then we had this residual effect from grazing management that was on top of that, which was a little bit smaller, and that was around 0.2 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year. So that's a relatively modest change compared to sort of high rates of change that we might expect from other land uses, like up around a tonne of carbon per hectare per year. But it shows that it is possible. And it's, I guess the other key point about this is it took a long time for that to develop into a significant relationship that we had confidence in. So there was higher soil carbon sequestration initially, which has evened off. But to give us, we have to do, when we're doing an analysis, we need sort of more and more time points to give us a bit more power and a bit more confidence in that result. And so it's taken sort of up to 10 years of data for us to find a significant difference from a scientific perspective. So the second question I want to address is why were there no differences when we looked at all the studies across Australia? So if we've got one grazing management study here that's showing a significant difference, why, when we looked at all the studies across Australia, was there no difference? And probably one point, because we hadn't published that study at the time of the meta-analysis, it wasn't actually included in that base data set. It's just at the point of being submitted for publication now. So the things that cause differences or can cause differences is context-specific responses due to climate, soil type, baseline soil carbon levels, and even pasture composition. So we might expect grazing to have a different result under those different circumstances. And this is the graph down the bottom. So the figure down the bottom is results from an international meta-analysis that looked at this from studies across the world. It showed that C4, which is a summer growing species, they could increase in soil carbon as grazing intensity increased. But where we had a C3 or a temperate based pasture system, that generally decreased with grazing intensity. So that we were having these two different results based on a different environment, different system. There's clearly a lot of variability in management of how these systems are implemented and, say, the level of utilisation between those systems that could be impacting on these results as well. The confounding effects of other management, and as I showed with that study that we've done at Orange, we had that underlying effect of pasture establishment, but there could be many other things that contribute to that. Like a fertiliser treatment or other things that are also impacting on some of those results. And probably the final one is the sampling methodology. Generally, research trials are running over a relatively short period of time, often around 5 to say 7 years for a grazing trial. That's a relatively long bit of work, unfortunately. And so we're not getting the time to build up to show these significant differences. Spatial variability is a big one, and I'll go into this in a bit more detail as well. Also, differences in sampling depth and the duration that the management's actually been imposed is also an important factor. So one of the key things that I think, or we think, as when we're teasing apart why this didn't occur, is that there's just a lot of variability out there, and this is a massive challenge. And so we've got really two types of variability, main sources of variability. One is variability over time, which may be related to the management change, but may be related to other factors, environmental factors, so whether that's rainfall and other things. And so often when you're measuring these things on farm, you're just measuring between two time points, and you might see quite large increases. But because we're doing scientific studies, we're often looking at the treatment that changed and one that's not. And so we might also see that same increase, but we know that all the treatments were increasing and there was just a relative difference that might have been quite a bit smaller between those treatments. And we also know that things don't always go up and they can go backwards for different reasons. So whether that's a poor season or other nutrient dynamics that can impact on soil carbon. And we've seen this with, this is example on the left here is from a long-term trial at Condobolin, where we found soil sequestration that occurred over 12 years actually was lost within 3 years. And then we've got within paddock variability, or within site, if you're looking across multiple paddocks to do a soil carbon project, and there's really can be high degrees of variability within paddocks, and which means you need really high numbers of cores, a well-designed sampling strategy to actually pick up significant differences between treatments. And so often that variability is too high, and it means that we find it difficult to actually pick up those differences. So finally, what else can change carbon? There's really two things that we've reliably see change carbon in Australia. One is converting from cropping to pasture, and that's in the order of change of about across a number of studies we've found around 0.75 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year over a 5-year pasture phase. It's pretty consistent. The other one that we've found is relatively consistent is improving soil fertility. And so the main sort of mechanisms that are obviously involved here, one is improving the productivity. So we've got more above and below ground biomass. But there is also a role in additional nutrients in the soil stabilising organic matter and making sure that that organic matter that's in the soil is in more stable pools that are more likely to be resilient over the longer term and stay there rather than being lost with the environmental constraints. And so we think that's another key part. And this figure here just shows the difference between a site that didn't have any phosphorus fertiliser and one that did over 20 years. And on average, it was about 0.5 tonne of carbon per hectare per year over that period. So just in summary, commercial paddocks, there's differences in soil carbon are generally small. They'll take time to develop, and that's between different systems. We still might see some environmental changes that are quite rapid, and they can be difficult to detect. There can be context-specific change, which is one of the main reasons that we don't see differences, as well as the variability. And a sampling method that's not adequate to actually pick up that high change, small changes with such high variability. And there are land management changes that can be implemented where we have a lot more confidence that we'll see changes in soil carbon. So I might pull up there and hand back over to Susanna.
Great, thanks, Warwick. And thanks, Sarah and Matt, as well. If you'd like to turn your videos back on, and we'll jump into Q&A. There are a couple of questions coming through there. It's really complex set of results here, high variability plus geographic variability and a whole lot of other factors affecting soil carbon. So thank you for kind of going into that in quite a bit of depth there. I guess just one question that I want to kick off with before I see what the audience are asking about. Could perhaps this is a question for Warwick, Sarah, I'm not sure which, but can you say a bit more about the other benefits of the effects that you see from grazing management? So you talked about grazing management affecting the drivers of carbon. So I guess therefore you've got some co-benefits from those effects too, for example, erosion reduction. Would one of you like to say a bit more about that?
I might just pick up on some of the productivity benefits. So generally we see greater stocking rates being able to run with intensive rotational systems because we distribute those animals more evenly throughout the landscape. And so we can generally pick up a little bit of production per hectare from an intensive rotational system over a more set stocking system. That does come a little bit at the expense of per head production as well. So often continuous grazing, animals have the ability to select whatever they want, and so they can have higher per head production. We also do see that those high ground cover levels with intensive rotation and lower stocking rates obviously have can reduce erosion as well. Sarah, did you want to pick up anything else there?
No, I think you've pretty much covered everything. Thanks, Warwick. I guess there's also the benefits for composition, for example, lower stocking rates favouring the perennial species, I guess. And there's some impact of grazing management on biodiversity. That can be pretty context specific though, depending what species are being targeted there. But yeah, definitely a few other co-benefits, probably almost overriding carbon benefits in some cases.
One thing I was going to say there, Susanna, is the additional nitrogen mineralisation associated with higher organic matter. And if you build that up, I think we've done studies in the past. If you build up organic matter, that can be worth between $120 and $200 a hectare with additional N nitrogen mineralising, and then that's used by the plant. So you get productivity benefit from the organic matter as a co-benefit sort of thing. I was going to say the other thing was encourage people to put questions into the Q&A box, and they're starting to come in now, or raise your hand if you like. So sorry, Susanna.
That's all right. Thanks, Matt. Well, it's probably a bit of a follow-on question from what Sarah was just talking about then. Question from Jen. In the meta-analysis, was there a relationship between above ground biomass as a result of grazing strategy and carbon increase?
It's a good question, but in our analysis, we didn't actually test that relationship. So there weren't many studies that have actually examined both together, so both biomass and soil carbon, or not enough to do sort of any rigorous statistics around it for this review.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
I might just pick up on that. From the more detailed analysis we've done from our long-term trial, we actually don't see a result with total biomass, but there does seem to be relationships with components of pastures that are related to improved soil carbon. And it's more the green, say, perennial grass components. So I guess there's two types. You can have total biomass that's high, but you actually don't have as much actively growing biomass underneath. But if you've got that high level of actively growing biomass, that does seem to be associated with high soil carbon change.
Okay, thanks for that. There was a few questions mentioning biomass, actually. So also in relation to root or below soil mass, can that ever be considered as a proxy for carbon?
I think it could be considered as a proxy for soil organic matter. I think the difficulty still comes with just measuring that below ground root production.
Okay. All right, so we've got quite a few questions coming in now. So one question here specifically for Warwick, in relation to management that does increase soil carbon, are there many studies that have looked at cropping to pasture cropping as opposed to cropping to pasture?
Yeah, we looked at this under the National Soil Carbon Research Project when we did that work. And so we've got a paper published on that. Basically, what we found was most of the time pasture cropping is actually implemented into a perennial pasture. So rather than the other way where you're going from an area that has been cropped, because you need the perennial grass component to implement the pasture cropping. And we did find that there was no drop in soil carbon with pasture cropping, but most of that studies were over a relatively short time period. So we really only had about 3 to 5 years, maximum 5 years data. So in that short-term period, the perennial, maintaining those perennials in that system didn't seem to decrease carbon as much, but I did have some other trial data on pasture cropping that we ran a while ago, and where we had no nitrogen fertiliser applied to that pasture cropping, we saw a much larger decrease in carbon than where we had put more nitrogen fertiliser on.
Thanks for that, Warwick. Now there's a question here from Michael about some data released by the ERF earlier this year, wondering whether that data was included in the analysis. And also a follow-up question to that is, what research have you got of carbon below 30 centimetres?
Sorry, you go, Sarah.
Oh no, you can go, Warwick.
Look, yes, there were soil carbon credits generated earlier this year, with the main method being grazing. And that's what I wanted to highlight today, that we can have changes, but those treatments didn't measure the null, which is if they had have just grazed that in the conventional way. So we did see a rapid response in carbon across those sites. The second part of your question is around soil carbon at depth. And really, we've looked at a lot of different instances where there has been, fence line comparisons where there has been claims to be quite large amounts of soil carbon at depth. And often we've found some physical factors in the soil that are driving that difference in soil carbon at depth. Really, I haven't seen any studies or any sampling that we've done where we haven't seen an effect at depth that we don't see at the soil surface. And generally what we see is the most difference in soil carbon is usually at 0 to 10, and then it decreases in the magnitude of that impact as we go further down the soil. So I know there's lots of claims out there that things happen at depth and due to a lot of different mechanisms, but when we've looked at these mechanisms, when we've looked into some of the individual circumstances that have been used as evidence to say this is happening, we haven't found the evidence to support it. So I guess my thought is if you're not seeing it in the top 30 centimetres, you're unlikely to be seeing anything special happening below that depth.
And presumably the cost and effort involved in sampling at greater depth is quite significant. So it's not a worthwhile long-term prospect to be doing that sampling.
Yeah, it's a lot more time and adds up to more money put into getting soil cores deeper out of the soil, where you'd be better off putting that money into getting them spatially across the site, because that spatial variation is a massive limitation.
Yeah, okay.
I guess just adding to that, I was just going to say, so in our review, I think about a third of studies measured carbon to about 30 centimetres depth, and about 5 other studies included to deeper than that. But you can see we've just included a table in that review which has each of those studies and the depth to which they sampled listed in that table, if you just want to have a look at that yourself also.
Yeah, we'll put the link to the paper in the chat so that everyone can have a look at that directly. There's a question from Rob here, which I think Matt might be typing an answer to, but I'd quite like to hear the answer to that as well, if you don't mind there, Matt.
So what I was going to say was we've published a paper on that. So just for the benefit of the others, Rob's question was, is there a saturation threshold sort of thing? We've looked at that for a range of soils, management types and climates. And as you said, Rob, it's very contextualised to the site by fertility, by climatic conditions sort of thing. It's generally higher for clays because the particle size is smaller, and less for sands. And if you get more rainfall, you tend to gain more faster, but it doesn't influence the actual saturation at the top. So, I mean, as a general rule of thumb, you could say 8% for clays, very fine clays, and about 4% for sand sort of thing. That's a generalised thing, but Warwick might have specifics for the soil at that site. I noticed that it was going up there. It was starting to plateau a bit towards the end before you had the loss.
Yeah, I can talk about that. We did 25 other paddocks around that long-term trial, and in the top 10 centimetres of soil, they averaged around 1 to 1.1% carbon. And so at our peak in that long-term trial, we had close to 2% carbon. And we know from fractionation that was mainly particulate carbon, and particulate carbon is the coarser carbon in the soil that is prone to being lost due to environmental conditions. And so when that carbon went down, it was nearly all that particulate carbon that was lost. So we think that that's a mechanism. So yes, the soil type and the environment absolutely regulate the amount of soil carbon that can be stored.
And Suzanne just asked a question on that, which I think you just answered, Warwick. Why is there such a drop in soil C at Condo? So I think you just sort of answered it, but
we've never nailed the exact reason why. All we know is it's related to being particulate carbon and an environmental impact. But it didn't happen in all the systems at the same time, but it happened over a 2-year period that they started to drop. So we think it's related to the amount of soil carbon. There was a change in the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which meant that there was more carbon compared to less nitrogen. We think that was involved. So we think it's actually some nutrient availability relationship. But again, we never had the opportunity to really, or data to tease apart exactly why.
I might just jump in here before we go to the last couple of questions. I do have another poll for the audience here. So we're just going to take a pause on the questions. And this second poll that we're running here is just to get a bit of an idea from those of you in the audience about what you might have taken away from this webinar and other areas that you, I guess, kind of keen to find out more on. So once again, it's a quick poll with just 6 questions, or multiple choice or a quick rating. So those of you in the audience, if you wouldn't mind just clicking on that and give us a bit of an idea of, I guess, your knowledge about grazing management and soil carbon prior to the webinar, and then also whether that has changed following the webinar. Obviously, we've still got a couple of questions to go, but I did just want to pop this in now before we have those remaining questions. So don't forget to scroll down. There are 6 questions. Also keen to just know what element of a webinar like this one you might particularly have taken something away from, be that seeing the science in detail or talking about the results in a broader sense. Now, obviously, like we've said, it's a topic that's got an enormous amount of detail within it. So depending on your perspective and where you're coming from to this discussion, what sort of information you actually need to find out more. So question 4 is just what other areas you might be looking for more information in. That's obviously relevant for us in planning future webinars and other events of this nature. And question 5 there is, having sat through and listened to this for nearly an hour, will you go and talk to other people in your networks about what you might have found out today about soil carbon? That's particularly of interest, because it's really great to know where the discussion about these kind of topics is filtering out, you know, beyond the room with the 65 of us here today. All right, so there's 35 of you have done the poll. I'll just give it a couple more minutes. It'd be great to get a few more results coming in there. Thank you, and I'm sorry for interrupting the flow of the questions there, but I was also thinking, if there's anyone out there who's been got a burning question, now's your chance to put it in the Q&A, and we'll get to a couple more of those questions before we wrap up. Okay, I think I actually will let that poll keep running while I ask the next question. So it was a more detailed question from Jen in the Q&A there about some details of the grazing experiment in Orange. So there's a few parts to that question. I think the one about sampling to 30 centimetres has already been answered. But how did you assess and measure when animals should come back to a pasture in a rotational grazing situation? And I think that's probably a question that people who are directly managing land would be quite interested in, how you tell when to bring the animals back.
Yes, so we had, the way we established the treatments was with a steering reference group, and one of the key things that they were interested in at the time was the fast rotation generally had the animals going back at the optimum stage of development for a pasture, so just when it's sort of at the end of that stage 2 type development. But there was a bit of a push at that time to let those rests go a bit longer, so that was one of the key drivers of that. Also, because I like to say, when we're designing an experiment, no treatment is the optimum management. What they're designed to do is to put variability out there, and so the one treatment that we threw in on top of that sort of design experiment was the fully flexible one, so we could make sure that the animals went back onto that pasture at the right stage. And that was, we used the criteria that sort of has come out of sort of the literature, which is basically we had a cocksfoot dominant pasture that was sown, so that's a reasonably common pasture for the area of the world that we're in. And we were grazing that when it was somewhere between the 3 and the 4th leaf stage, elongation stage. So that's about the middle of stage 2, if you're more familiar with that type of technology. And so we were always sort of made sure that we came back. And the good thing about that grazing was we always grazed to a residual that was around 600 kilograms of green, because we were grazing with sheep. And often that was a little bit higher than that, particularly sort of in the peak growing season. So that's sort of how we manage that feed allocation across those treatments. But because we had some of those static treatments, there was definitely times when the higher stocking rates were over-exploiting treatments, but we had the lower stocking rate to pick that up. But that stocking rate difference didn't explain differences in soil carbon at all across the trial. And just pick up on why 30 centimetres, really that's the IPC standard and minimum standard. We'd had considered going deeper, but basically our aim was to get as many cores spatially across that side as we could, and so we trade off a little bit of depth to get more spatial coverage.
And that's the paper that I think you said is just been submitted for consideration, is that right?
Yeah. So yes, so you've seen the results from it in this presentation, and that work is just about to be submitted to a journal for publication.
Cool. Thanks, Warwick.
I just had one additional question on that, Susanna. It was really a
Yep.
supplementary question. So that the flexible grazing thing that you had, Warwick, of deciding when and when not to put them in. Let's say, for example, that had the most beneficial effect on soil carbon. I can't remember whether it did or it didn't. Let's say it did. How does that conflict with ease of management sort of thing? So is there a synergy between easy and flexible, easy management to do and soil carbon gains, or is it you get the most soil carbon gains with a horrendously labour intensive management approach? You have to move the animals in and out every few days sort of thing.
Yeah, look, I actually think the rest in the pasture is the key thing. So we were clearly focusing on intensive rotational grazing in that trial, and we did find that there was no difference, say, between 15 paddock and 30 paddock in soil carbon. There is in composition, which is starting to open up now. The more set closely, actually, it was related to the amount of times we grazed below 1 tonne of dry matter is directly related to the level of perennial grass that we have in those treatments now. So it's not that it doesn't have an impact. Soil carbon differences are just smaller unless you go to fully set stocking.
So just on that, do you think it's rest period that's more important or grazing intensity during the grazing, or both?
Personally, I think it's rest.
Rest, okay. That's good to know. Thanks, Warwick. Sorry, Susanna.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's really useful. I mean, they're good questions, Matt, because it's taking it down to the practical level. Moving animals around all the time is not the easiest job sometimes. So thanks for bringing it to the practical. All right, so very quick question here. Well, it might not be a quick question, but how accurate are the soil carbon management measurements, and is the technology already robust, or is there a bit of work needed on getting technology that can measure soil carbon well?
I'll pick up on that one. Matt might like to add something to it after my answer, but it's accurate for what you measure. So we can get a core out and we can have a high degree of accuracy with what we're measuring in that core with the methods that we have. As I've tried to allude to in my presentation, the biggest problem is we've got these massive sources of variability out there. And so the only way when you're designing a sampling program to get over variability is to have more points or more coverage. So where is this heading? Because there's a big cost limitation from getting cores out of ground. It's massive. We really need to move towards these hybrid techniques where we can use the data that we're collecting through modelling approaches, whether that be systems models or process-based models or machine learning type models to predict the increase in carbon, but we'll always need ground truthing because that's what anchors models. If you don't have that ground truthing, then you have a number and you don't know how close that number is to reality. Generally, if we can get that number started in the right place, we have a better chance of being able to predict it going in the right direction. So I think modelling will play a larger part in the future. It will be linked to remote sensing. It will be linked to physical measurements because we just can't get enough cores out of the ground to get to the level of accuracy we'd like.
Yeah, I completely agree, Warwick, and I think the Australian government's got what's called the National Soil Carbon Innovation Challenge to reduce the cost of measuring soil carbon down to $3 a hectare or less. and I think current costs can be anywhere between $50 and $100 a hectare for physical coring. Theoretically, it really depends on your soil variability. So if you had a homogeneous soil that was absolutely identical and the pasture was perfectly identical for your whole paddock, never is, but if it was, you'd only need one sample because it's identical everywhere. But if you've got a very variable paddock, soil types and topography and grazing management and pasture density, which is quite normal, the more physical samples you need to train the model from satellite imagery or machine learning, and the more physical samples you need, the bigger the cost. So it's an area of active research. We've got other projects on machine learning and process-based modelling and a lot of other research internationally and nationally, some people on the line about that, but we're a long way from measuring statistically significant change in soil carbon between 2 points, which is what government methods try to do, and getting that in an accurate, statistically significant way that's low cost. So that usually the variability within a paddock is more than the change that could reasonably occur in a few years. So that's a big challenge.
And that really speaks to a comment that Jen has made in the Q&A there as well, about the fact, we are dealing with complex systems, and multi-species, multi-paddock grazing is about complexity. So how do we reduce it to factors that we can study when it is complex? And ecology, biodiversity have the same issues. Greater diversity, greater complexity is a positive thing, but it makes it very, very challenging to measure in a scientific context. So I guess that's an ongoing challenge to be grappled with. So we've just got 2 more questions here, which we might just fly through in the last couple of minutes. So just following up on that answer, Matt, that you gave about saturation of carbon. So saturation, when measured as a percentage, is possible, but in terms of tons of soil organic carbon, is unlimited, as you can you continually build your soil profile over time? Is that the case, that you can continue to build that soil profile on an unlimited basis?
No, you can't.
Yep.
Oh, sorry, Warwick.
No, I was going to say exactly the same thing.
Soil's a bit like a bucket of water. You can only fill it up to a point, and then it'll overflow, and it won't go up much further. So you can keep it maintained. It's hard to add more, but you can easily go down, as Warwick showed in his last point. He had an 11-year gain, and then it was all lost in about 3 years, I think. So it doesn't really. I prefer percentage because it's a concentration, but you can convert to tons of soil carbon per hectare just by multiplying by the bulk density and the depth. But you have to know the bulk densities of your soil, so the mass per unit volume. So I prefer percentage, but as some soil carbon markets often just operate in tonnes per hectare, but generally it does saturate, and that's influenced by how long that good management is maintained and whether you get a drought. So a drought will tend to set it back again. And then you have to, in practice, it's very hard to saturate because you always get constraints. Drought knocks it back, or poor management, or as Warwick had in his data there.
So as an example, we've looked at this a lot. Where you start from has a big impact on how much you can store, and is probably one of the bigger impacts. And we know that often, say in the top 30 centimetres, we're only changing your soil carbon by about 0.3%. So that's higher in the 0 to 10 with improved land management, or somewhere in the order of 10 to 12 tonnes of carbon per hectare before we start to plateau out and not increase. And the reason for that is the more you put in, the more that gets mineralised back out the other end. So it doesn't just build up. The more you put in means more comes out. And that comes out in the supply of nutrients back through to plants. So you should have a more productive system on average if you can sort of maintain those inputs and make sure it's balanced with other nutrients.
Thanks for that. I think we might have to leave it there because we are just about to hit, 11 o'clock in my time zone, but 2 o'clock in some of the other time zones there. And I think from what you've just been saying there, Warwick and Matt and Sarah, the change is going to be, there's going to be ongoing change in soil carbon because of all these other factors. But I think also there's a key message there around there's still value in doing it, because if you start from a low base, you've got that opportunity to build it up. And there's also that opportunity to try and maintain that carbon for a whole range of benefits. All right, well, if there's no final comments from any of our speakers, we might wrap it up there.
I'd just like to say thanks everyone for your time and thanks for attending.
Absolutely, yes. So we do, actually, there's a good reminder. Kylie's just popped the email addresses for our speakers in the chat here. If anyone does have any follow-up questions, I will email out the recording of the webinar to everyone that registered. So if you anything you want to have another look at or share it with colleagues or networks, that would be great. Yeah, thanks everyone for your time.
Thanks, Susanna.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See you all.
Bye.